During dinner, my girlfriend's relatives hurled food at me. She simply grinned and said, "You should feel fortunate we even allowed you inside." As I cleaned my face, her father chuckled. I remained silent. But at dawn, he was yelling outside my room, all because During dinner, my girlfriend's relatives hurled food at me. I still remember the shock of it all, a barrage of cold, hard vegetables and scraps of meat slamming into my skin like thrown daggers. My girlfriend, Samantha, merely grinned and said, "You should feel fortunate we even allowed you inside." Her tone was as if my presence were a rare concession rather than a given right. I sat there, stunned and mortified, as I dabbed at my face with a napkin, trying to erase the evidence of my humiliation. Her father's low chuckle from across the table only deepened the sting. I said nothing, not because I was cowed, but because I couldn't fathom how to respond to such cruelty. The dinner had been arranged at Samantha's family's sprawling, antiquated estate, a house that reeked of old money and older grudges. From the moment I stepped inside, I sensed that I was an intruder in a world governed by unyielding tradition and silent judgments. The gaudy paintings on the walls and the meticulously set tableware only heightened the dissonance between my humble origins and their refined airs. I had been warned in vague terms that her family was protective, even possessive, of their way of life. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the open hostility I witnessed that night. As the food continued to be lobbed in my direction, each splatter on my clothes and skin felt like a public dismissal of my worth. I tried to maintain a semblance of dignity, though internally I was seething with confusion and hurt. Samantha's sly smile persisted as she observed my silent suffering, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling mixture of amusement and something else, something that I couldn't quite decipher. It was as if she were both amused by and complicit in the humiliation, a realization that sent a chill through me. After what felt like an eternity, the assault ceased, and the room settled into, a heavy, oppressive silence. The remnants of the meal lay scattered on the table like casualties of a war I had not enlisted in. I excused myself quietly, withdrawing to a small, nondescript guest room that had been set aside for me, a room that felt more like a holding cell than a place of respite. The sparse decor and threadbare furnishings did little to alleviate my embarrassment. I sank onto the edge of a creaking chair, my mind reeling from the evening's events, trying desperately to piece together what had triggered such an unprovoked attack. I couldn't help but replay every moment in my head. Had I said something? Or perhaps revealed a truth they didn't want to face? I'd been invited into their home by Samantha, and yet her family treated me as an interloper, a mistake, a stain on their pristine legacy. Their disdain was palpable, a silent force that permeated every corner of that grand house. I remembered fleeting glances exchanged among them, the barely concealed smirks that hinted at secrets and unspoken rules. In that moment, I realized that my presence had upset a delicate balance, one that had been maintained through years of unyielding tradition and rigid expectations. Throughout the rest of the night, I lay awake in that dim, cramped room. The steady tick of an old clock and the occasional groan of the ancient building were the only sounds breaking the heavy silence. My mind wandered through a maze of self-doubt and confusion. I wondered if I was simply out of place or if there was something more sinister at work, an unknown transgression for which I was being penalized. The more I thought about it, the more I recalled subtle hints from previous encounters, offhand remarks about not fitting in, cool indifference, and a general air of superiority that permeated every interaction. Samantha had always been enigmatic, her behavior oscillating between warmth and detachment, leaving me to question which version of her was real. Sleep eluded me as I ruminated on every gesture and word exchanged that evening. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow moving outside the thin curtains of my room, or hear the distant murmur of voices in the corridor, sounds that, in the quiet of the night, seemed laden with ominous intent. I tried to force myself to sleep, hoping that the morning light might bring clarity, or at least an escape from the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in my chest. Then, as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, a new and more disconcerting reality emerged. I was roused from a fitful sleep by the sound of raised voices in the hallway. At first, they were mere murmurs, but gradually they swelled into harsh, angry shouts. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. It wasn't long before I recognized the unmistakable tone of Samantha's father, a voice I had heard earlier, laced with that cold amusement, now transformed into something fierce and unyielding. I hesitated, unsure whether to remain hidden under the threadbare blanket or to confront whatever awaited me. Summoning a reluctant courage, I pulled aside the curtain to peer out into the dim light. There, just outside my door, stood her father, his face twisted in a scowl and his eyes burning with a fury I had never witnessed before. His shouts, muffled by the thin walls yet undeniably forceful, carried accusations I could barely comprehend. The words were lost in the clamor, but the intent was clear. He was enraged, and his anger was directed squarely at me. The realization sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Whatever had happened, whatever slight or mistake I had unwittingly committed, it had escalated into something far more serious than a mere dinner debacle. For a moment, time seemed to slow. As I sat there, caught between the instinct to hide and the need to understand the source of his wrath. My mind raced with questions. What had I done to provoke such an outburst? Had my very presence in their home been the catalyst for this anger, or was there something I had unknowingly triggered during that ill-fated dinner? The memories of earlier snide remarks and cold glances replayed in my mind, each one now a potential clue to a mystery I had never imagined I'd be part of. The sound of his voice, now growing louder and more insistent, seeped through the walls and into my consciousness, leaving no doubt that this confrontation was imminent. My heart hammered in my chest as I considered my options. I could either face him head-on, risking further humiliation and perhaps something worse, or retreat further into the safety of isolation, hoping the storm would pass on its own. But deep down, I knew that avoidance was not an option. Whatever had sparked this fury was tied to the very fabric of my relationship with Samantha and her family, a tangled web of expectations, secrets, and unspoken resentments that I had unwittingly disturbed. With trembling hands, I rose from the chair and approached the door, each step measured and heavy with foreboding. I took a deep breath and, summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, cracked the door open just enough to see the man who had become the embodiment of my inexplicable guilt. His eyes met mine, and in that brief, charged moment, I saw not only anger but also a glimmer of something else, disappointment, perhaps even sorrow. It was as if his rage was a mask, concealing a deeper, more personal betrayal. In that tense silence, the early morning light did little to soften the harsh lines of his face. His words, when they finally came tumbling out in a torrent of emotion, were nearly unintelligible, a jumble of accusations and exclamations that left me more confused than before. All I could decipher was that he believed I had done something unforgivable, something that threatened not only the sanctity of his family, but also the legacy of values they held dear. As his voice rose and fell with each impassioned outburst, I felt the weight of my own uncertainty and regret pressing down on me. I stood there, caught in a moment that promised to redefine everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the cost of simply being an outsider. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, his yelling reached a crescendo. A final, desperate note that hung in the air like a challenge. My heart pounded in the silence that followed, and I realized that my life was about to change in ways I could neither predict nor control. I closed the door slowly, my mind reeling with unanswered questions and a deep-seated fear of what this confrontation might unleash. In that breathless moment, standing on the threshold of a new, unsettling reality, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As I closed the door, the sound of Samantha's father's shouts still echoing in my ears, I sank back down onto the chair, my heartbeat deafening in the stillness. A sharp mix of confusion, panic, and impending dread flooded me. I was caught, trapped in a life cycle of events and emotions I couldn't fully comprehend. What had just happened? How had it escalated so quickly from a dinner I thought I could simply get through to this screaming confrontation at dawn? I pressed my hand against my forehead, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Samantha's father, her fiercely protective, traditional father, had always struck me as a quiet man, reserved to the point where his gaze could seem distant, almost calculating. But today I saw a different man entirely. His anger wasn't merely loud, it was visceral, raw, as though whatever triggered it had been simmering for longer than I realized. And through all of it, Samantha hadn't intervened. She hadn't stopped him. In fact, she had allowed it. Worse, the way she had looked at me in that moment, like it was all some kind of game or spectacle, had shaken me to my core. The faint sounds of the house came back to me, and I realized just how isolated I had become inside that tiny room. The house, this imposing mansion that felt like a fortress of old-world values and secrets, now felt like the walls were closing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind that brushed against the window, seemed to heighten my awareness of the very real despair that filled my chest. I thought about Samantha. She had always been different around her family. Detached, cool even, something I chalked up to the comfort of old relationships and dynamics. But the look in her eyes earlier, I had assumed we had something special, something she was invested in. Now it felt like I was an outsider, somehow marking a misstep I didn't even understand. Minutes passed before I mustered the courage to peel myself off the chair. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the door again. The yelling had died down, but a cold, immovable tension lingered in the air, a silent promise that whatever came next would be heavily consequential. I stepped out into the hallway, my mind swimming with thoughts of explanation, or rather, some semblance of defense. Had I truly done something to provoke this reaction, or was I simply the wrong person in the wrong place? I could hear voices from downstairs, Samantha's father, I assumed, speaking in harsh tones again. But this time, I couldn't pin down the words. Too many distorted accusations, too many half-formed and hidden grievances. The house buzzed with the underlying hum of conflict, and the closer I got to the stairs, the more desperation and fear crowded my senses. I encountered Samantha in the hallway before I could make my way downstairs. She stood there, almost statuesque, as though she'd been waiting for me to come to her. I braced myself for an explanation, for some kind of reassurance from the one person I thought knew me better than anyone else. Her expression, however, was difficult to read. Her usual warmth was gone, replaced with an unsettling stillness. "You heard that?" she asked, almost nonchalantly. "Yeah," I responded, my voice quiet and unsure. "What in the world was that about?" Samantha hesitated for a moment, looking away briefly, clearly trying to choose her words carefully. "I didn't know he'd take it that far," she admitted finally. Her eyes flickered to the door behind me, then back again to me. "Look, I never thought it would get this crazy, but I told you my family's complicated." "No kidding," I said, trying to mask my growing irritation with a calm voice, though I could barely contain the confusion. What does he think I did?" Samantha bit her lip, wringing her hands nervously. For the first time, I saw the vulnerability in her that I hadn't noticed before, the cracks in her usually flawless demeanor. "You were too forward, offended him. He doesn't like when people don't follow the rules. You're not even going to tell me what rules." My frustration was starting to bubble into something more vehement. "You bring me here to your family's fortress, you let them throw food at me like I'm some animal, and then you won't even tell me what the hell I did wrong?" Samantha flinched at my words, her normally composed veneer slipping for just a second. She glanced downward before meeting my gaze again. "I never thought they would treat you like this. I didn't know it would go this far." Her voice was cracking, half apologetic but fearful. "Please trust me. It's complicated. You don't know them like I do." Everything she said seemed so vague when I was confronted with the reality of what had already happened. I turned, taking a few steps down the corridor. Samantha's voice continued behind me, pleading in a soft whisper, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying. One moment I was a privileged guest in a luxurious home, and the next moment I was a pariah, An outsider to be tolerated, but never truly invited. I reached the staircase and stared down at the empty, polished floors below. I didn't want to confront her father. I didn't want what was happening to be happening in the first place. But it was inevitable, wasn't it? If I didn't face the man who had wreaked this awkward, painful conflict, there would be no resolution. It was like standing on the edge of some precarious precipice where the only thing left to do was jump. I continued down the stairs slowly, Samantha's voice mingling faintly behind me as she begged me to stop. But I needed this confrontation. I needed to understand where the hatred was coming from and if anything between Samantha and me could survive the storm that was closing in around us. Samantha's father stood there at the bottom of the stairs, no longer yelling but still seething. His posture, stiff and rigid, exuded a quiet fury. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed, though not with surprise, more like expectation. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I could feel the weight of everything pressing down. As if it was all preordained, he turned and spoke, but this time the words seemed to hit differently. "You don't belong here," he said coldly, his words cutting through the unfamiliar silence. "You never will." My chest tightened, and in that moment, the words stung with an undeniable finality. 57 seconds in. The days following that fateful dawn, I wandered the silent corridors of the mansion with a heavy heart and a mind teeming with questions. The anger in Samantha's father's eyes, the cruelty of his accusations, and the raw vulnerability that had flickered for just a moment haunted me relentlessly. I couldn't shake the feeling that his fury was not solely directed at me, but was rather an eruption of a long-suppressed pain. A pain tied to secrets that had tormented his soul for decades. Determined to find answers, I began piecing together fragments of whispered conversations and half-forgotten recollections from the previous night. Every murmured word, every furtive glance exchanged in the shadowed hallways pointed to a dark family history, one that had slowly suffocated the warmth out of every room of that ancient estate. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the sprawling oaks lining the driveway, I sought out Samantha. I found her in the overgrown garden behind the mansion, her silhouette framed by the fading light. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were downcast and pensive. I asked her quietly, "What exactly is going on with your family? Why did they treat me like that?" She hesitated, her voice trembling with an emotion she'd long kept hidden. "You have no idea, do you?" she murmured, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. "My family has always been obsessed with appearances and honor. There's a legacy, an ugly secret, that they're desperate to keep hidden. And when you showed up, it was like a spark that set off a powder keg." Her words tumbled out in a rush, laden with both regret and resignation. She spoke of an ancient feud, of broken promises and a love lost in the depths of betrayal, a story that had been passed down in hushed tones and coded warnings. "My father," she continued, "has spent his life trying to protect a reputation, built on lies and blood. Your presence, it reminded him of everything he's been running from." As the weight of her confession sank in, I felt a mix of disbelief and sorrow. I recalled the dinner's humiliation, the barrage of food, and the venom in the sneers of relatives who regarded me as an intruder. Now it became clear that my arrival had stirred up more than just superficial disdain. It had unearthed long-buried wounds. In the days that followed, I began to stealthily explore the mansion, a labyrinth of dark wood paneling, heavy drapes, and ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every move. I combed through forgotten rooms and dusty libraries, hoping to uncover clues that might explain the deep-seated hostility simmering beneath the surface. Late one afternoon, while lingering in a secluded corner of the mansion's library, I stumbled upon a stack of old letters and diaries hidden away in a battered wooden chest. The faded ink and brittle pages recounted tales of forbidden love, bitter rivalries, and a legacy of honor twisted by revenge. One letter, in particular, addressed to Samantha's father, sent shivers down my spine. Its stern admonitions and cryptic references to redemption and sacrifice hinted at a scandal so explosive that it had shaped the destiny of the entire family. I learned of a time when honor was defended with ruthless determination, a time when a single misstep was met with unyielding retribution. It seemed that the dinner's cruel spectacle was only the latest eruption in a long history of unresolved grievances. That night, the mansion transformed under the cloak of darkness into a stage for quiet revelations and secret reckonings. The storm that had raged outside earlier now subsided to a persistent drizzle, the sound of rain mingling with the low hum of whispered confessions in the dead of night. I found myself drawn once again to the study, a room that held the weight of decades of pain in its every crevice. With trepidation, I knocked on the heavy oak door. Inside, I discovered Samantha's father alone, hunched over a desk cluttered, with aged documents and mementos. The dim light of a solitary desk lamp revealed a man who bore the scars of his own regrets. For a long, heavy moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up, his eyes a tumult of anger and sorrow, and said, "You've come back, even after all that's happened." His voice was softer now, stripped of its earlier venom, and in that fragile tone I sensed a desire, not for further punishment, but for absolution. I mustered the courage to ask him directly, "What is it that you fear? What secret has been awakened by my being here?" He stared at me for a long moment, as though weighing the risk of unburdening his soul. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he began to recount the story of a love that defied the rigid codes of his family, a love that had been forbidden from the start. Years ago, he confessed, he had been involved with a woman whose beauty and passion were matched only by the scandal her presence incited. Their affair, doomed from its inception, had ended in tragedy. The betrayal, the public shaming, and the irreversible damage to the family's reputation had forged a cycle of bitterness and retribution that spanned generations. Every time I see someone who reminds me of what might have been, a different choice, a lost opportunity, it feels as though the ghost of that past returns, he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. I've tried to bury it, to keep it hidden, but your presence, it has unearthed everything. Listening to him, I felt an unexpected surge of empathy. Here was a man who had spent his life protecting a legacy built on pain, a man trapped by duty and haunted by the mistakes of his youth. I reached out, placing a tentative hand on his calloused arm. "I'm not here to judge you," I said softly. "I'm here because I care about Samantha, and I care about understanding what has driven all this hatred. We deserve to break free from the chains of the past." For the first time, I saw a glimmer of remorse in his eyes, a spark of the man he might have been if he had dared to choose love over honor. In the following weeks, Samantha and I embarked on a journey to reconcile the fractured present with the tormented past. We spent long hours poring over old diaries and letters together, piecing together the mosaic of secrets that had defined her family's legacy. Each revelation was a small victory against the relentless tide of bitterness. We discovered that the cycle of retribution had been fueled not just by a single tragic love affair, but by a series of missteps, each one compounding the family's wounds. With every piece of the puzzle we uncovered, the oppressive air of the mansion seemed to lighten, replaced by the tentative promise of change. Slowly, small acts of compassion began to emerge amidst the turmoil. Relatives who had once sneered at me began to soften, their eyes betraying a reluctance to perpetuate a cycle of cruelty. Even Samantha's father, once so rigid and unyielding, started to show signs of inner conflict. It was as if the walls of his heart, built up over years of silent suffering, were beginning to crack. One rainy afternoon, while we sat together in a modest parlor bathed in the soft glow of a waning day, he turned to me and said, "Perhaps it is time to let go of what has haunted us for so long. I cannot undo the past, but I can try to forge a new future, a future where honor is measured not by cruelty, but by the capacity to forgive." His admission, tentative as it was, felt like the first step toward healing an entire legacy of pain. As autumn deepened and the chill in the air grew more pronounced, Samantha and I, together with a few brave members of her family, began to reshape the very essence of that storied mansion. We renovated a neglected wing, transforming it into a small haven, a sanctuary of honesty and hope, far removed from the oppressive traditions that had long defined our lives. In this space, we held long, candid conversations about the past, about mistakes made, and the price of unyielding pride. We laughed, we cried, and slowly, the scars of old wounds began to fade. I learned that redemption is a gradual process, born out of the willingness to confront painful truths and the courage to embrace change. Now, as I sit in the quiet of an early winter evening, I reflect on the extraordinary turn of events that transformed a night of humiliation into a journey of self-discovery and reconciliation. The mansion, once a mausoleum of buried grudges and bitter legacies, has started to breathe again with the promise of new beginnings. Samantha's family is still on a long, arduous road to healing, but there is a palpable sense of hope, a hope that the cycle of retribution may finally be broken. I no longer see myself as an outsider condemned to suffer for others' sins, but as someone who, by daring to love and to question, helped open a door to a more compassionate future. The storm of that unforgettable night may have passed, but its echoes still reverberate in the quiet moments between heartbeats. Every day brings new challenges, but also new opportunities to rewrite our stories. Stories that are no longer defined by the cruelty of the past, but by the resilience of those who choose to change. And so, as I step forward into the uncertain light of a new day, I carry with me not only the scars of old wounds, but also the strength born of forgiveness and the belief that even the darkest legacies can be transformed through love, honesty, and the unyielding determination to forge a better tomorrow.